Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa, and we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Tradable country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. Finally, if you enjoy this potty, please subscribe, like, share or comment on our social media and consider buying us a coffee if you'd like to help support our work. Now on with the show.
Speaking of supporting our work, we generally like to give a shout out to those that make a small or big donation to the Lentil Intervention. And for this particular one, well, the message that accompanied it piqued our interest, and here we are. Now, if you've been following our podcast for the last few episodes, most of them, they have revolved around the topic of degrowth. Yet there is one particular link, a big one that we are well known to talk about, that we have yet to make. And this is certainly the conversation for it.
That's right. So today we're sitting down for a chat with the phenomenal Deirdre Kent, a long-time environmental activist who over the years has been involved in numerous research and campaigning efforts, as well as co-founding various organisations and political movements, most recently helping establish Degrowth Aotearoa, New Zealand. Deirdre is also a prolific writer, having authored 6 books, her latest being The Big Shift, Rethinking Money, Tax, Welfare and Governance for the Next Economic System. So, is our current economic paradigm still fit for purpose? How does our diet fit into all of this? Let's talk about it. We're so looking forward to this chat today. Deirdre, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure. Yeah, over the years I've certainly started a lot of organisations. I headed them up once. I mean, in the 70s, in the women's movement, I was involved in the starting of 5 women's organisations during the 70s. So that's a long time thing.
Well, you started life off as when we say life, your professional career, I guess, as a teacher.
Yep.
But a lot of your passion lied around activism and writing concurrently. So, putting yourself out there, but also putting your brain to task and so on. So tell us a little bit about that journey. Like you said, you've co-founded or founded so many organizations, and tell us about life and as activism, especially, going a few years back now.
How it started. Well, I didn't know I was an activist. I knew that my father was an activist in the church and on apartheid and God knows what other issues. But I didn't think of myself as a writer. In fact, I hadn't done very well at English at school. I only became a writer when I had to learn, when I had something to say, and I had to say it clearly. And I've got a sister that teaches writing, so she bullied me into short sentences and active tense and so on, as they do, and editing galore. So that's it was the 70s when I became an activist. Really, I was a young mother of 4 children, and I'd had a sort of a depression. It was the early days of contraceptive pills, and anyway, I was stuck at home with 4 kids, and I couldn't figure out what the purpose of life was at all, and I was very concerned. And after a few dramas, I struck a psychiatrist who said to me, "Actually, you should. I've never known somebody with so much potential who's got such a low opinion of herself." He said, "You want to get involved in something, do something with your brain." And so I did. Instead of sitting at the university women meetings thinking, "Ooh, that person's stupid, oh, that person's silly, why don't they do this? Why don't, as they do?" I changed from being a backseater that was jibing into I got myself on the committee, and then I stood for president of University Women. Well, that was the beginning, really, because it was the beginning of the women's movement in 1974, in a small town, Tauranga, in New Zealand. And so I was, involved with the women's movement, set up a International Women's Committee, and then we set up about 5 organisations during the 70s. And at the end of the 70s, I stood for council. Oh, wait a minute, no, I stood for the Values Party in 1975. Yeah, so that was the first environmental party other than Tasmania in the world. And when I read the manifesto of it recently, I noticed it has the seeds of degrowth, and that economic growth creates environmental problems, and we need to question it. And that was as far as we went, I guess. It was all about population in those days only, to some degree. Then in the 80s, we moved to Auckland, and actually, no, let's be honest. I moved to Auckland, and my husband followed because I couldn't get a job in a small town. I had been too active on environmental and women's issues. I'd been high profile in the local paper, and it was actually the editor of the chief reporter of the local paper that helped me learn to write decent press statements and get them accepted in the paper. And I'm very grateful to him. And so I couldn't get a job because some place I applied for was the Labour Department. I applied to be an employment officer, I think. Yes. And they said, no, we can't have you because you're anti-employment. You opposed the a factory somewhere in the hills or something. I can't remember what it was even. And I don't remember doing it. But anyway, I couldn't get a job, and I got so frustrated. My husband couldn't see that I was frustrated. He was a GP in Tauranga, and he didn't understand how important it was that I was chairing a committee of, I think it was the University Extension. And I looked around the committee, and there was the principal of the high school and the principal of this and somebody else who had a high job. They all were on good salaries, and I was the volunteer. What on earth am I doing this for? Why aren't I paid? So I wanted to get paid. And so I moved to Auckland to see if I could find a job. And I got a job, and my husband, after a marriage reunion, came with me, and the 2 teenagers who were a bit bamboozled by that. And we had 2 sons at university too. So they all got a bit of a shock. And John was marvellous that he adapted to life in Auckland and left his GP practice for me. So I was very lucky. So I was a decade in ASH as the director of ASH, and I was paid. I did get a job in the Labour Department in Auckland for a start, and found that I couldn't breathe for the blooming smoke in the air. And I thought, oh gosh, I'll start an organisation called the Non-Smokers' Rights Movement, because there was one in Australia at the time. And I started to look around. I went to the Heart Foundation, I went to the Cancer Society, and they said, oh, we've already started an anti-smoking organisation, and there's a part-time worker there. So that was fine. I stayed at the Labour Department and got asthma at night time from the smoke, and nobody would do anything about it. And so the part-time worker eventually changed jobs, and they asked me to apply for the full-time job, so I did. I had a decade there, paid as a full-time lobbyist in tobacco control, which was good grounding for political reality and the power of big business. Well, it was bigger in those days, I guess, the Tobacco Institute, and the relationship of bureaucrats and politicians and media, and I understood the reality of it all, that you have to actually change public opinion before you can get 1 or 2 MPs on board, and And then you have to change more public opinion, and then you get some more MPs on board, and so on. And we got really good legislation really early, 1990. It was an international movement. We learnt from Britain and Canada.
Transition town Ōtaki. Because that sounds really fascinating. Now, to our listeners, for most of you, I had to remind myself where Ōtaki was actually, or is. So, North Island, between Palmerston North and Paraparumu, kinda. So it's on the west coast of the North Island, but low North Island. So north of Wellington, of course, but going up the west coast, the Kapiti coast, and on the way to Palmy. So tell us about this.
In the early 2000s, we were all concerned with peak oil and climate change. And we were I was just learning about it. Some people had learned about it before, I'm sure. But I had just been introduced to it in about 2003, and peak oil. And they were together, and transition towns were started up to start local groups all around New Zealand. And the founder of it, Rob Hopkins, came to New Zealand, and we all went to his big do up, and I can't remember where it was, Taupo, I think, I'm not sure, and learned about how to set one up. So I came back with great enthusiasm, and we learned about peak oil and started to worry about climate change. So we started to, and the object is to forget about what central government's doing, just to get a group locally who want to be prepared for what's going to happen in the future. Some of them said, well, I'll start a surplus vegetable and fruit and vegetable stall every week, and we'll raise money. So they did. Everyone brought their extra, because Ōtaki's got a fabulous soil, by the way. It's a very old town, about 27% Maori, I think, and with the first Maori university there, Wainana. And they've got bilingual signs in shops. I had it for ages, by the way. And we had a group on energy, and there's 2 energy groups were set up out of the transition towns. And then I realised that we should have a currency, and so we started a Timebank. Green dollars had gone out of fashion at that stage, and time banks were pretty fashionable and easy to set up. And so your unit of exchange is an hour, and every person's hour is worth the same. So it was just lovely. Some people who were in wheelchairs could read books to kindergarten children, things that people hadn't thought of. I got some woman to do something in my garden that you couldn't advertise for, but we did. It was strange. She was painting signs to frighten the birds away or something. I don't know what it was, but those who you couldn't do something which you did for your own work. If you're a plumber, you couldn't do plumbing because the Inland Revenue didn't like that. So the rest of it, we just invented jobs to do and did it. And we learned, we met all sorts of people we would otherwise not have met. It was a real good exercise in community building.
So a lot of politicians, a lot of big business, they really do push, green growth as the way forward. Mm-hmm. But why do you think that the degrowth movement is a better paradigm, better way to tackle it? So what's the definition? What are the key principles? Why is this the way?
Put it this way, for a couple of years, just before January 22, I was really reading about collapsology, why we can't help but collapse. And I read a lot, and I got quite depressed.
That's a problem when you read a lot. Yep, we know the feeling.
Yeah. Plenty of chats off air about this between myself and Ben.
Anyway, about the 15th of January, I suddenly woke up and I thought, there's one more chance. I've heard about this degrowth and various things that I'd read. And the movement was strong in Europe. And so I thought, oh, I heard Mike Joy on the radio the other day saying we should have less of everything. I'll ring Mike, he lives near me, and I'll ring Jack and see if we can start a degrowth group. So I did, and Mike and Jack and I got a few more people in, and we thought, Nathan's obvious. And after a few months, Sarah joined us, and it all went completely crazy after Sarah got there. She was amazing. But we're reading Jason Hickel. He's pretty well, a lot of people read him. We need to reduce the throughput of energy and material, and yet return to living within ecological limits in a just and equitable way. Now, the just and equitable is really hard to agree on, because it's really a political choice, and there's huge movements in every direction, in lots of directions. So I had come from the New Economics Party, where we'd worked for 4 years trying to marry two policies. I'd got to the end of writing my book on money, and it was very clear that tax was going to be an issue. And I had struck somebody in the Georgist movement, Henry George, named after Henry George, who wrote Progress and Poverty. And he said land tax must replace income tax. And how simple that is, So we wanted to marry land tax with monetary reform. It's the money system that causes the growth imperative, because when money is created by commercial banks, which do most of the money creation, as interest-bearing debt, they create the principal but not the interest. So since there's no interest being created, everybody has to compete for that, and someone loses out, and they have to go into more debt. And the gap between rich and poor widens between net creditors and net debtors. So it not only creates a growth imperative, you've actually got to have more money in the system to provide for that interest each time, but you also are constantly widening the gap between rich and poor. And of course, COVID's made it worse, and successive governments have made it worse.
So we seem to be in this constant spiral, and it's only getting worse. How does one either stop the spiral, or how does one effectively short-circuit it to bring about a change? How do you bring about change in this when this is happening? You can't just stop overnight and say, from tomorrow we've got a new way of going forward.
Well, of course, I've been championing, is that a word? The Tradable.
It is on this podcast.
Tradable energy quotas. I don't know where I first heard it. I think I first heard it through Wise Response. It's a Dunedin-based organisation of academics. It's really interesting, a lot of people. Where the economist David Fleming in England in 2008, 2007 had invented tradable energy quotas, which was a form of rationing of fossil fuels, which not only, because you have the rations declining each year progressively, reduces your fossil fuel use, but it also reduces emissions, and it is a sure way of reducing emissions. And you give everybody driving age and over a free allocation you give them a year's worth for a start, and then you give them a week's worth after that every week to top it up. But businesses and governments have to tender for theirs, and so they buy theirs. And these rations or quotas are tradable. You can sell them back to the registrar and you can buy them off the registrar. And so the heavy energy users can buy extra units and the low energy users can sell their rations if they need to. So it does a little bit for inequality. It doesn't propose to do it all. It couldn't.
So in terms of mitigation policies, though, emission trading schemes are probably more routinely discussed, really well known being the European Union ETS. Talk to us about what the key differences are and why the tradable energy quotas are better and fairer.
Sure. Emissions trading scheme is bound to fail because of political reality. It hasn't thought about the political reality. We've got a government who's focusing on cost of living, and I'm sure you have too. Cost of living, and they don't want the price of petrol to go up because it brings up the price of everything else, or diesel to go up brings up the price of everything else. So our government has already interfered with the market so that we've had a couple of failed auctions. We're constantly trying to reform this ETS scheme, and it's been going in New Zealand for 25 years. And only been going for 15 years, but it's been thought of for 10 years before that. Now, during that time, it hasn't reduced emissions. It hasn't reduced gross emissions in 15 years. And, there was lots of reasons. I won't go into them now, but even now, they're still expecting the price to get really high of the unit. And it's unrealistic politically. I mean, it's inexcusable that politicians can't see that. And senior bureaucrats ought to be able to see that because that's their job, to look at political reality. And as for journalists, they certainly should see that. So, but we're so invested in it, Emma. All the work, the fifth, 100-page documents that come out of government departments make me wild because all that energy is being wasted. How we transition, I haven't a clue. It's really a challenging issue. But basically, we have to face up to the fact that it's not going to work. Even the woman who wrote the original paper, Catherine Leaning, has said, we have to supplement it with other issues, with other policies. So does the minister now. So it only covers 45% of the emissions, and it's only the big businesses that really get affected, and you have to have the price really high. And you have this section of high energy use trade exposed businesses who get off almost scot-free. They only pay 10% of what they should. The likes of the steel making, aluminium making, we give them cheap electricity and have been doing so for years, and they keep threatening to go away, and they'll stay because they get such cheap energy. But basically, tradable energy quotas, everybody's involved. Everybody, actually, you talk to anybody about the ETS, what do they know? Could you explain it to me? Could you explain our ETS system to me? Ben, I suppose you probably could because you're pretty switched on about it, but it's really damn complicated and very hard to understand. And I don't even, I've tried very hard. But, if I talk to people next door, they wouldn't have a clue.
So if tradable energy quotas are seen to be better and more equitable, which is an important component, what are the challenges with it? Why are we not seeing it then be discussed more and even try to be implemented? What are the challenges around it?
Well, Britain went through all this. In 2010, they had a big all-party parliamentary report on it, where all the relevant government departments looked at it, and they came up with the fact that it's the best of all the possibilities, and they said it was ahead of its time. Now, I suspect it was lobbied by big business. You can imagine how much Fonterra would love it. Not.
Or in Britain, what, the coal industry?
Or the coal industry, or Exxon Mobil. No, but it's simple because you only surrender your units, your rations, when you buy petrol, diesel, natural gas, or a fraction of or electricity, which is, about 18% of our electricity is fossil fuel. So you're only doing it, a few times a year, and the rest of the time, a furniture manufacturer, for instance, would have to build in the price of the units they would have to buy, they're called TEQs, Tradable Energy Quotas, they'd have to buy to transport or manufacture furniture. So everybody, every industrialist has to buy a form of fossil fuels, unless they're just working on electricity. And there's no electricity in New Zealand that's been totally decarbonised, because it all goes into the grid and gets mixed up.
Yeah.
You mentioned Fonterra before. In New Zealand, a lot of carbon emissions are derived from the agricultural industry. So how would a tradable energy quota scheme work to reduce the agricultural emissions?
Okay. Well, take the dairy industry. A lot of urea used. To make urea, you need natural gas. It's done in Kapuni. They would have to buy their units when buying. So the price of urea would go up even further, which would price a lot of dairy farms out of existence. And governments, it doesn't mean to say that governments do nothing. Governments have to come in and do something, to help, but not with buying the units for them, but helping them transition to something else.
And just kind of follow-on question, maybe one of the last before we move more into the food side of things, but with the tradable energy quota, how is that better or more equitable than, opting for something like a straight-up carbon tax, for example?
Well, a carbon tax is a price-based scheme again, so it's not politically real. Well, what happened to Julia Gillard over there?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Macron with his yellow vests, he was very quick to respond to it and stop it, because you can't do it politically. You can't raise the price without riots.
But we're making it sound very negative, but cost of production goes up.
Mm-hmm.
Of stuff, but that's the whole point of degrowth is consume less. So it's helping achieve that. But at the same time, it also brings in creativity. Would it put dairy farmers out of business? It might put them out of dairy farming business.
Mm-hmm. That's what I mean.
But then that's where there's encouragement for creativity and for moving away to, okay, well, actually, what else can I be farming?
Exactly.
And that's where, when we're looking at going back to the original concept of transition towns and so on, okay, well, what about back to crops? Because that's potentially what the land was used for, and be more organic and be more, as we don't need as much of the nitrates and the phosphorus and all these inputs that are fossil fuel generated, or from conflict countries, or from all sorts of all the negative components. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be the transitioning itself could be, that could be the sort of the pain point, but it does serve its purpose. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just we got to accept that we need to change the way we behave.
You mean it's not necessarily a bad thing to put up the price? Is that what you're saying?
Things are so cheap. Yeah, correct.
No, I disagree. I disagree, because we're talking energy. It's one thing to put up the price of cigarettes. Not everybody smokes them. Yeah. And they're bad for you, and they're not essential, but energy is totally essential. What David Fleming wrote is that as people prepare for next year, when they will have fewer TEQs, they will have less of a ration to work with, fewer rations to work with. They have a year to plan their next year reduced energy lifestyle. Now, if they plan well and adapt, if somebody who's commuting a long distance for a part-time job says, I'm going to stop that, I'm going to get a business where I at home with my friend, they're adapting to the relocalization and the lower energy lifestyle. And if people adapt, then the price of TEX will go down. It's different from ETS. Price goes down when people actually adapt because they're planning. The businesses have to plan, local governments have to plan, organisations have to plan, central government has to plan how to use less next year. And if they do their planning well, and everybody's in the same boat, you actually talk about it, which is different from ETS. Nobody talks about ETS on the street.
It's more of a community approach, which is key here.
Community approach. Everyone's pulling in the same direction, and you're trying to get the price of it down.
So it ends up being a lot fairer for people from lower socioeconomic status as well. They're not being priced out.
No, it doesn't do too much for it certainly does a lot for people who are low energy users. But if the price is going down, it doesn't do all that much. There's other ways of getting equity: resource taxes, land taxes.
Yeah, it's one of the multiple, I guess, solutions in the toolbox, so to speak. It's not one thing's going to work in isolation. It's a culmination of a whole lot of
for equality. Yep. No. Yeah. Start with the principle that the earth belongs to everybody.
So let's move on to the topic we kind of teased at the very beginning. A comment you made before I thought I've got to get Deirdre on. But to be fair, Sarah Crest did also mention you and say we've got to get you on and talk about exactly what we just have, tradable energy quotas. But an interesting point that you made, and it is interesting, is the connection between being an environmentalist and the food we eat, because so often we have all these passionate environmentalists that do good work or they try and advocate for change, but hang on, what about the food you eat? What's the importance of that connection between the food you eat and trying to be an environmentalist, saving our planet?
Well, it's very wonderful that when you do it for health reasons, you find it also good for animal welfare. It's also great for the environment because you're using less land and water. You're polluting. I mean, it's absolutely a win-win-win outfit, changing to whole food, plant-based. And whoever does it for one reason, they usually find there are other two reasons to do it as well. People don't want to face up to the food that they eat. But New Zealand has done a study on emissions from food. Beef in general was miles ahead of everything else. From the point of view of land use and emissions. It worries me, that there is so little awareness of, the environmental thing you can do at breakfast time and lunchtime and tea time. It's so easy. And have we got a national study going on as to what can be grown where, or is it all up to country calendar and the country life? They're both very good on, a dairy farmer who wanted to grow something, avocados or whatever,
Just for our listeners, just to mention a few books that do make the connection between diet and planet. On if they go to our website under our resources tab, we've got our recommended book section, and there's some books like Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moelape, Dr. Richard Oppenlander's Food Choice and Sustainability, Healthy Eating, Healthy World by J. Morris Hicks. There's a few more books on there. These are books we've read, highly recommend. And yes, they make the connection, the important connection, and even some fantastic quotes from there. That how can you not make that connection? So yes, absolutely head on over there.
Realistically though, do you think New Zealand can repurpose its agricultural land for other horticultural crops effectively, considering that the dairy industry is so big? It's like almost $20 billion worth of exports per year. So to kind of reshape our industrial agricultural system, to be more in line with sustainable practices and degrowth mentality. Do you think that can be done, or do we need a completely new system shift?
Well, it struck me that one of the things we've done over the last 40 years is constantly increase our exports and at the same time increase our imports. Well, we can get away with less of each. Don't need all those imports and you don't need all those exports. What tripled our dairy in the last 20 years, something or other. Huge increase. And it's miles ahead of everyone else. But because we've increased so fast, there's no reason why we can't decrease as fast as well. But what are you going to do? What are you going to change it for? Fruit and vegetable and grain exports. Where's the study? Where's the study of the soils and what can be grown in which bioregion?
So one thing that you can certainly teach us a lot on, based on your years of activism, a couple of the books you've written is on lobbying. And, we often, we generally always try to finish or end an episode with positive, how we can take action. We do often say, one of the actions is writing into your local government, your local council, parliamentary member, etc. So in terms of lobbying, how effective is it? Does it actually make a difference?
Now, one of the things with lobbying is that you get a really leap in campaigning awareness when you get an excellent image. There was Fina Cooper in 1975 walking from Northland with her granddaughter. A lovely image of, older woman with a younger woman walking, back view or front view, I can't remember. But there was, we had 273 crosses on the lawn at Parliament to highlight the deaths from passive smoking. And we got a big leap then. Persuade someone who does filming, who does small documentary films to do a documentary film for New Zealand. That gives you a big one. All those leaps that you make are very important, with the images. But you start with the likely organisations. You don't expect overnight to. I remember writing to MPs early on, and the only good reply I got was from Helen Clark. And there were one or two saying, go to hell, and I thought, well, we know who our opponents are, but Helen Clark was one of the early MPs to say yes, but we only had one or two MPs at the very beginning. And 7 years later, she was Minister of Health, and we became, we got our legislation. But be high profile in the media, and of course these days media is so much more complicated. We've got to recruit all these young graduates who are going into, instead of going into public interest lobbying campaigning, they're off to work for the fossil fuel company or off to Australia.
Deirdre, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. We've loved hearing about the fight that you've been fighting for so long, whether it's tobacco to everything now in terms of the big topic, which is around degrowth, and absolutely love that the whole Degrowth Aotearoa New Zealand. You heard Mike, got in touch with them, Jack, and now you've got this amazing organization. At the time of this podcast recording, not by the time we listen, but Mike has just done a presentation in Tauranga. So this movement is growing, the conversations are being had, and that's another form of lobbying effectively. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
Cheers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.